Yeah.
Not tolerance.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, there's something in there, I feel like this is just kind of loosely related. I was thinking maybe connected a little bit more to the earlier thing, which is that heterosexuality is the norm, it's the expectation. And so without outing ourselves, without using language, without, I feel like there's sort of a backlash of like, why do you be so gay and in our face all the time? Like, but it's like, well, because it's not visible, and because what our queerness is a private event, right? It's the same as anyone else's sexuality. It's pretty private, but it's also pervasive, and so there's something about needing language to make ourselves not just not exist, but to be distinctly in existence or something like that. And to me, yeah, that moves. We have to move beyond tolerance into celebration.
Well, I agree with this whole thing about tolerance. It is like taking a lukewarm bath. It's like wash off. But to ask for celebration is difficult in a culture that doesn't really value celebration, or that really isn't a celebratory society. And really, our whole movement toward secularization, while it helps in terms of democratic values, etc., has often been a move away from the very festivals, rituals, practices, cultural events that were, whatever else they may be, were great events of celebration. And so we have replaced that with a kind of system of values and ideas which advocate tolerance, the rule of law, etc. So the question would be, in essence, how do you celebrate something when you have a culture where perhaps the highest value really ensconced in that culture is tolerance? In other words, the whole idea of religious tolerance. And so we've carried that over into human relationships. To have a kind of celebration of particular kinds of identity would mean that we would have to radically change our society. And I think that would be a good idea for any number of reasons. But the question is, how do you do it? And is it possible to create or generate false celebrations? In other words, can you just say, okay, we need a celebratory culture, let's create one? Because a lot of times the continuity of celebration comes from community. It comes from that long-established practices which can become more tolerant, more open to other elements of society that do not share those beliefs, whether they're religious or cultural practices, but still it's deeply rooted often in a kind of irrational, emotional heritage. And I don't know if you can create that simply by asking for it. I mean, I think, and one of the other issues I think we have to remember, for me anyway, when TC says that heterosexuality is the norm, it very much is, but we have all sorts of other enforced norms. For instance, Christianity is an enforced norm. The symbols and the ideas, the icons of it are everywhere. It just permeates society. So the question becomes, what do you do about this? I mean, part of the definition of homosexuality comes about just because in the 1850s, the Victorians are like, well, we need to define heterosexuality. Well, let's define what it isn't. So they start out by defining homosexuality in order to be able to define the norm of heterosexuality. And this, of course, has created any number of problems where you have an identity that is, in effect, imposed upon basically private practices, private realities, people's emotional lives. But it's weird, isn't it, to think that before 1850 there was no such thing as a heterosexual or homosexual. And isn't it weird to think that we think we're more advanced? I don't know. I mean, and one of the questions I think is, really, when you have a society which, and part of our values are that in order to be tolerant, we have to, in a sense, okay, this is Protestantism, this is Catholicism, it's all fine, you know, it's all fine. If this is the state, this is religion, it's all fine as long as we are tolerating these boundaries and norms. So what do you do when you have that as a value in your society, but at the same time it means that identity is often imposed from the outside in, where various groups look at other groups and say, they're weird, they're abnormal, they're X, Y, or Z. And then at the same time, many of those groups have learned that they have to take back the definition of the experience. You know, the Black Power movement, it's like taking this term, which had been entirely a pejorative and an insult, and saying that's the name we're calling ourselves now. We're taking that back. So I don't know. It's an interesting question, but it's one that I agree with the tolerance. But I suppose maybe in a way, the celebration begins with each of us. You know, just agree. Yeah.
Okay. So we have a few minutes for some questions. If anyone in the audience would go ahead and just tell whoever you're directing it toward, or if not, our names or.
Well, Rebecca talked about this especially, but the issue of identity. In my mind and in my life and experience, the identity is of who am I? Which I guess is maybe the basic question. Is a question that's asked in the linguistic or the verbal realm, but the answer isn't there in my experience. The answer is the nature of, for our species, consciousness from the time that we were born until the time we start walking and talking, and then basic, this presence of being starts to, the awareness of it starts to fade. And my view is that it's the lucky adult that never loses that, which is the basic birthright of sense of wonders and other associated human experience. It's something that I guard very carefully in my life.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Any comments?
Yes.
Well, you said in the previous reading, I think you called that the infant mind or the child mind. Did you have to get back to that? You were talking with David Ray. I think that's true. I mean, I think that sort of celebration that I'm saying might begin with each of us would have to begin, perhaps, in that child. I have to say, though, that really, I don't know is the question, who am I, is some fundamental human question. Janice alluded to this a bit, but there are languages which are a problem with noun, subject, and predicate doesn't exist. And so the question becomes, is there really a subject about which you're saying, who am I? Or is it just that your whole language has structured it so you have that problem forever? And so when we think about other languages, or to the degree we know them, we begin to see, and this goes back to, I think TC was talking about, that language is part of the experience, that having a different language, and that can include changing your own radically, allows you to have different experiences. So the questions that you seem to be stuck in now may not even exist. The framework is gone. In other words, as long as you have a particular frame, you're always looking at squares or rectangles. But when the frame is gone, it's just all space and emptiness. And I think, for me, the earliest memory I have is I was about, I think I must have been about 5 or 6 months old. And it's dark and it's warm and there's this rocking movement and the sense of another person next to me and the smell of lilac. And it's a memory of me as an infant being rocked by my grandmother. She was very fond of rocking me in her rocker. I found out later. But when this memory first came to me, I was just like, what is this? You know, what is the sense of? I could feel myself being contained, as it were, by this warm darkness, by this fragrance of her scent. And yet at the same time, that feeling of connection and being with her was also, and this is my later self, or later view, or whatever, looking at it, saying, it's like there's just this edge. It's just like the edge of the horizon, this kind of perceptible sense of like, yes, that's a moment where I became conscious that I existed, that I became conscious that I was a separate person, that I wasn't one with my mother, my grandmother, the world, but that there's one moment where there's like this. But I can't talk about it in terms of like the self or identity or who am I. That's partly why I have to write poetry. If I could say it in some other way, I would. It'd be a lot easier. But, you know, and so it's basically the questions are driven by our language with which we pray.
I agree. So we actually don't have time for any more questions, so I wish we did. We have another program in here in 23 minutes, but if you want to say what you're thinking, if any of our panelists have something they want to respond briefly, like really briefly, I'd love to hear anything else you have to say in the next 1 minute. Sorry. I'm forced to be the time enforcer because I'm organizing the events. Well, go ahead, quickly.
I wonder what the panel thinks about the proposition that as a broader gay community, we have some work to do ourselves about putting identities on each other. And then if I'm explaining to a mainstream straight audience, if you will, like extended family, I can't go into a continuum of, oh, well, lesbian identified bi, well, I'm queer today, or this.
Well, you could, but you might not.
I might not expect them to get that.
Yeah.
But with gay community, when I get the same kind of puzzlement, when I try to launch into these kind of more complex continuum discussions, and you get that kind of puzzlement, or, well, we need you to be in a camp. You know, kind of. I find that challenging, so I just wonder if we among ourselves sometimes don't have a little more work to do with not wanting to impose identity on each other.
No, it's a constant thing, isn't it?
We've got a ton
It's an old idea.
Yeah, we've got a ton of work to do there and with our own racism. And, I mean, I would say, I would actually encourage us to start with that racism first. And yeah, and our own other forms of queer and biphobia and, yeah, I think the queer community has a lot of work to do in terms of turning the mirror back on ourselves and saying, who are we excluding, not just outside the queer community, but within our community as well. That's my
I recently ran into someone who I used the word queer. Like, well, what's the Q for? Well, it could be questioning, it could be queer. But when I brought up the term queer, there was a visible uneasiness still to using that word, and I think we need to make sure that that word is able to be owned by everyone, both heterosexual, homosexual, whatever. Because if we don't encourage it, people are still going to be, like, I don't want to use that word. I think we should allow everyone to own it if we're all going to celebrate together.
Language is never fixed. I mean, that's part of the idea of the panel is this idea that there's a kind of mirror between what we write, and then we go into spaces, we speak that writing aloud. You know, I mean, the poetry and language is oral. It's not meant to only be written down, at least in my opinion. And then, you know, as Rebecca said, and Janice and T.C. Andrew, you know, we can really not say what we are. People see us as other things. We call ourselves something. And I think there's an importance of being alive in the sense of play and suffering in all those things. I mean, there's a way that you can play with what you call yourself, and that's okay. If you choose not to, other people see yourself as something else. How do you handle it? Do you care? I mean, you could go on forever about any of those things. But being aware of it, you know, being aware, and then writing itself is a different enactment of that allows us. I mean, it allowed me. Writing changed my life. I wouldn't be here without reading, without my high school, junior high English teachers. You know, I wouldn't